So this is the part where we all just stare at the screen and allow folks to trickle in. Admire Kadji's tan.
And envy. Admiration and envy are very close together, say psychoanalysts.
Yeah. This was a nice return to intellectual life after my little beach vacation. What could be better?
You were away for a week?
For like 5 days, so a good amount of time.
Nice.
And so this is not one of the questions that I was going to ask you, but how is the reception of your current book going, Avgi?
It's going very well. I'm very happy. You're talking about sexuality beyond consent.
Beyond consent, yeah. I can't wait to read it, and I hope that people in the audience who are trickling in who like this book might be interested in reading it as well. I'm sure that it must have. I was seeing places where it seemed like there would be resonances with this book. But if you want, I'd be happy to ask about that during the Q&A too.
I think that there are some natural connecting points, especially when we talk about the trauma discourse and kind of how it's weaponized right now and what it does in psychoanalysis. So there's definitely connections there to make.
Okay, great. Well, there's going to be lots of material for Q&A, so that could be one of them. But I can't wait to get to that book as part of my summer pleasure reading.
Pleasure is quite the word.
Pleasure and pain reading.
But speaking about intellectual summer fun, like your Trans Materialisms podcast, amazing.
Thank you.
Amazing.
Exciting for me to hear about the people who have been listening to that.
It's really terrific. Like maybe we could drop this in the chat. So that people can find it easily. It's such an amazing.
Let me see if I can find it and drop it in the chat. That's a good idea. Thank you.
Sure.
I found it on a number of platforms, Kadji. So if this isn't the preferred one, this was the first one that came up.
Wow, you're so good at that.
From iHeartRadio.
This seems fine to me. Yeah.
I love it.
It was really fun giving this interview.
It was really cool to also see you just like travel through these different domains and just weave them all together so masterfully. Like really beautiful work.
Oh, thank you, Avgi. Yeah, this is one that I was just spontaneous. I didn't write anything out for it. So it was really fun to just go for it and go for all the ideas. I'll be a little bit more formal tonight since we're venturing into psychoanalysis.
We're starting a bit formally as well, so.
Oh, okay. Well, we'll match then.
All right, so I think I'm going to kick things off while folks continue to roll on in. You can see in the chat there are some links, as Kadji mentioned, about Avgi's previous book or current book, but not this book. There are links to explore as well as podcasts and videos and such. But we are here tonight for this event. So good evening and welcome to tonight's live online author event with Greenlight Bookstore. We are thrilled to host tonight's event with Avgi Saketopoulou and Anne Pellegrini presenting their new co-authored book, Gender Without Identity. They will be talking with Kadji Amin, so you're in for an excellent time. Before we start, I just want to say a huge thanks to Avgi, Anne, and Kadji for making this happen and to all of you for showing up. We are grateful for your support and for the chance to make space for conversation and connection. Couple of quick housekeeping things. In our Zoom webinar tonight, you can see and hear the speakers, but they can't see or hear you. They can see that you're here though, and there are a couple of different ways that you can interact with the authors and with each other throughout tonight's event, which we highly encourage. The first is the chat, which you can find by clicking on the icon that looks like one speech balloon. You're welcome to post your comments and thoughts in the chat. It's a great way to show your appreciation for the authors and interact with fellow attendees. We'll also continue to post links there as well. If you have a specific question you'd like to have answered by the authors or panelists, please post that question in the Q&A module. You can find it by clicking on the icon that looks like 2 speech balloons. We'll be pulling questions only from the Q&A to be answered in the later part of the program. And now our speakers. Our interviewer tonight is Kadji Amin. Kadji is an associate professor of women's, gender, and sexuality studies at Emory University and a fellow at the Cornell Society of Fellows. He is the recipient of a Mellon postdoctoral fellowship from the University of Pennsylvania and a Humanities Institute faculty fellowship from Stony Brook University. He is currently at work on his next book, Transmaterialism Without Gender Identity. He will be speaking with our featured authors, Avgi Saketopoulou and Anne Pellegrini. Dr. Saketopoulou is an immigrant Cypriot and Greek psychoanalyst living and working in New York City. She is on faculty at the NYU postdoctoral program, where she also trained and teaches nationally in several psychoanalytic institutes. Her published work has received numerous prizes. Dr. Pellegrini is professor of performance studies and social and cultural analysis at NYU, teaching classes on queer theory and psychoanalysis, as well as a practicing psychoanalyst. They are the co-author of 3 previous books and has also co-edited 2 anthologies and is founding co-editor of the Sexual Cultures series at NYU Press. In the newly co-authored book, Gender Without Identity, both Drs. Saketopoulou and Pellegrini offer an innovative and, at times, unsettling theory of gender formation. They jettison core gender identity to propose instead that gender is something all subjects acquire, and that trauma sometimes has a share in that acquisition. Avgi and Anne will start us off with a reading from the book, and then Kadji will respond. They'll be talking with one another, and then we'll be able to take questions from all of you. So please take it away, Avgi, Anne, and Kadji.
Thanks so much, Kay. It's such a pleasure to be here tonight and to be in conversation with Kadji. So let's just dive in. Gender without identity intervenes in current debates over transness and queerness within psychoanalysis and in the larger culture. On the one hand, we have the born this way argument, namely that some people are born trans or born queer, just like others are born cis or born straight. Now, no psychoanalyst explicitly espouses a born this way position, but it's the underlying presumption among gender affirming clinicians where it appears under the masquerade of core gender identity. On the other hand, we encounter what Avgi and I describe as the warped this way position, namely the idea that queer and trans individuals have deviated from the, quote, correct path of straightness and cisness because of trauma, because of the wrong kind of social influence, because of bad parenting, etc. The born this way argument is offered as a kind of countering to the violence of the warped this way position. It intends to insulate queer and trans life from pathologization and from therapies aiming to fix gendered and sexual deviations. Now, the onslaught of anti-LGBTQ legislation sweeping the country, with more than 500 such bills introduced so far this year, and the powerful homo-transphobic trends within psychotherapeutic fields can make it feel now more than ever that the only viable option for clinicians who don't see queer and trans patients as pathological is to double down on the born this way rhetoric, insisting that trans and queer experience reflects some core and immutable part of the self, that it is a true, innate, and authentic expression of one's innermost being. This may feel especially true regarding trans kids, whose very existence is challenged by today's anti-trans clinical activism and by the sweeping legislative and policy measures rippling across the US. A commonly cited proof, with the word proof in quotes too, is the idea that childhood transness is a symptom of trauma. If children think they are trans, this logic goes, this is a mistake. And the mistaken self-understanding arises because trauma has warped their connection with the true gender, as marked by their genitals and assigned at birth, and which is always already cis and binary. What such young people need, some clinicians then argue, is not transition care, but therapeutic attention to treat the trauma and to address these children's vulnerability to social contagion in order to correct their gender. This is not just a transphobic perspective, it's a traumatophobic one as well. And perhaps we can discuss the concept of traumatophobia in our discussion. Such views license lawmakers to pass bills that deny possibilities to trans youth and do so in the name of protecting trans kids from themselves. Hence the audacious euphemism of Montana's recent anti-trans law, which was named the Youth Health Protection Act. Avgi and I belong to a growing minority of psychoanalysts with extensive experience with trans and queer patients and who vociferously oppose the suppression of trans life. And we are ourselves members of the queer community. But perhaps surprisingly, we're not so quick to deny that trauma may have a share in how individuals experience their gender. In fact, our own work with trans children and trans adults leads us to a surprising and even counterintuitive observation. Sometimes transness, far from being a symptom of trauma, can emerge from trauma. And this is not specific to transness either. All gender, we argue in our book, is to some degree shaped by trauma. Said differently, gender is the outcome of how trauma forces the psyche to respond, which means that the psyche has to innovate and to invent. This invention is what we refer to in our book as self-theorization, though we want to emphasize that self-theorizations don't issue from a pre-existing self. Rather, self-theorization is how subjectivity becomes constituted in the first place. Second, self-theorization is not the work of a volitional subject who consciously narrativizes the self. Self-theorizing, as we're using this term, arises as a response to being breached by the other, by the other's otherness, and is driven by the exigency of the unconscious. It is driven, that is, by forces that are beyond one's conscious control, issuing from a perch that the ego does not command. Self-theorizations, to put it succinctly, are not produced from the self, but are psychic secretions of the self. If the connection we're making, that trauma may well be swirled into how one comes to be queer, sexually or gender-wise, if this is taken by some to equate to saying that queer life is somehow broken or in need of repair, this misinterpretation comes not only from homotransphobia, but, and this is one of our book's key points, it also comes from the unevenly restricted ways in which trauma is thought within psychoanalysis, including restrictions on which subjects and whose traumas psychoanalysis has traditionally been able or willing to think capaciously about. We wrote this book because we're tired of born this way arguments and the blackmail they spring from, namely the notion that any other accounting of queer and trans existence endangers us. There is a dire need for psychoanalytic ideas that don't capitulate to the notion that the only way to counter the pathologizing of sexual and gender complexity is by imagining them to be innate. Nor is it humane to regard variant genders and sexualities without the recourse of psychic complexity so routinely afforded to normative subjects. We're thus urging our colleagues to let go of arguing innateness as the LGBTQ party line. Not only have born this way arguments failed to protect queer people from violence and discrimination, not only are such arguments ethically short-sighted, at the end of the day, after all, it doesn't matter how anyone became queer or trans, because there's nothing wrong with being queer or trans. But from a psychoanalytic perspective, born this way arguments are also oversimplified and clinically naive. Acquiescing to the born this way rhetoric ensnares us into impoverished conversations about the complexity of queer and trans life and into pitifully inadequate clinical praxis. And finally, it impoverishes our capacity to appreciate the strange psychic agency that becoming trans, becoming non-binary, and becoming queer entails.
We describe this agency as strange because it is not willful and because it does not issue from a centered self. It is autonomous rather in a psychoanalytic sense, which means that it is always already allocentric. And now, to be clear, we're not speaking of an agency that is neoliberal in texture, as if subjects were free to select how to translate their own gender. And in our book, we provide a framework that refuses notions of innate gender identity for queer and trans experience in order to show that what gives gender its intrapsychic grip is the fact that it proceeds from the subject's own autopoietic process. It is this that makes one's gender feel one's own, even as gender is always already stitched together from materials that are not of one's own creations. Now, what this highly mobile process also means is that we do not and cannot control our own or another's gender becoming. If gender is a translation, as we argue with Laplanche in this volume, that is neither a volitional outcome nor a process that can be steered by another, be that a parent, a clinician, or a legislator. To account for gender this way is to look at development not as an unfolding of isolated potentials or as a succession of steps or stages within a teleological outcome, but as a sequence of external and psychic events that may be seen as a developmental path towards an outcome only when looked upon in retrospect. The how and where to of gender formation, in other words, can only be considered in the rearview mirror. If there is no final destination to gender, we may then arrive at our gender not once and for all, but over and over again. And for some individuals, gender could shift more than once across the lifespan. And this makes trying to predict whether a patient may regret their transition an impossibility. And as analysts, we have to accept that we do not have the special power of prophesizing the patient's future. And for the same reason, we believe it is more accurate to speak not of detransitioning, as if the patient got their gender wrong and is now returning to an earlier and true gender, but as retransitioning, because the latter term gets better at gender's evaluative potential. If we view gender as a matter of self-theorization and not of some true core, it becomes possible to imagine that trauma can inflect gender experiences, but without implying that this amounts to a distortion of some authentic self, as conversion therapies espouse. Put differently, we're pushing back against the assumption that gender is immune to trauma, or that gender, in order to be healthy, is uncontaminated by early traumatic intrusions, by adult interventions, or by the emotional debris of intergenerational pressures. Traumatic incursion, in other words, is always at work in all gender becoming. As long as the subject is able to modify what was handed down to them intergenerationally, and to forge out of those inheritances their own gender translations, gender is not pathology. To say this differently, no gender is unspoiled by trauma. So contemporary controversies over gender diversity, both within and without psychoanalysis, as Anne has been describing, can force psychoanalytic theorists especially to retreat to cliches or to fearfully cling to simple, seemingly safe narratives. But what psychoanalysis needs, if it is going to remain relevant and if it is going to promote and uphold queer and trans flourishing, is to venture into deeper thinking that can weather and contain the complexity of human life. It is time, as Laplanche urges in the epigraph to our volume, quote, "It is time to abandon slogans and think on our own," unquote. We advocate thus for thinking about development dynamically without falling into developmentalism. Attending to developing dynamically involves not tracking an expected progressively maturational sequence, but paying close attention to how such sequences are undergirded by the sexual unconscious and can only be accounted for in the après-coup. The querying of development we're proposing is decidedly not about noting where things went off course, so that analysts may intervene to course correct, nor does it mean identify where psychic life got bent out of shape so that it may be straightened out. Instead, what we want to do is foster spaces for thinking about the evolving dynamic dimensions of how patients, children, but also adults, change over time and come to their own idiosyncratic gender translations, especially those that may not line up with binary or gender expansive dictionaries. So gender without identity aims to recalibrate our attention, to build the theory and thinking we need, actually the theory and thinking that we have ourselves needed in order to be able to enable the flourishing of our trans and queer patients. And that involves being more in one's gender or queerness, less plagued by the fantasy that something is inauthentic or false, not because there is gender that is true, but because all gender is a mythological construction, albeit one with material consequences. Our starting point then is that there's nothing wrong with being trans or queer. There's nothing wrong, there's no wrong way to be trans or queer. And most importantly, there's no wrong way to become trans or queer. Even as we're pushing to expand ways for thinking and talking about gender and sexuality as complex becomings, however, we are not moving to legislate how any one individual gay, queer, or trans subjects accounts for their origins. So we're not saying that anyone who experiences themselves as having been born this way is wrong, or anybody who understands their gender identity as being solidly this or that is mistaken. The way we see psychoanalytic ethics is that individuals, especially oppressed minorities, get to use names and generate self-understandings that resonate for them, not for the analyst, not for the doctor, not for the lawmaker. What we want to do is make room for more ways for psychoanalysis, for clinicians, and for our culture to understand that everyone's gender and sexuality has a background and a history, that it is always partly scavenged from the outside, and it is always in response to the other's inevitable incursion into us, and that does not delegitimize them. Our book's ethical call is to offer metapsychologies and clinical spaces that treat gender and sexual diversity, not by making room for them or for accepting them. We do not want the philanthropy of tolerance. Our labor is for a psychoanalysis that is worth saving. That's a psychoanalysis that actively wants gay people and actively wants trans people. We want and deserve professional spaces that delight and marvel in the pleasures of difference.
So when Anne and Avgi reached out to me last December to ask if I'd be willing to read and maybe blurb the book manuscript for Gender Without Identity, it was as an avowed non-specialist. I not only do not use psychoanalytic theory in my own work, but, and I'm actually not sure that Anne and Avgi know this about me, I actually consider myself an anti-psychoanalytic thinker, someone avowedly on the side of Foucault and more recently Marx rather than Freud. Indeed, for my current book, Transmaterialism Without Gender Identity, I have been focusing on the margins of both psychoanalysis and the construct of modern gender identity itself, on working class trans people and low income trans people of color who are unlikely to encounter psychoanalysts except in the most violent of circumstances, on those who socially transitioned during a historical period before medical transition was available and before psychiatry as a field had been invented, and for populations in the global South for whom atypical gender is more an artifact of religion, labor, and kinship than it is one of psychic selfhood. What a focus on these non-coincident margins revealed to me is, first and foremost, that transness, in the broad sense of gender diverse life paths and social categories, is by no means dependent on the support of gender identity. To put it simply, one can, and I would argue should, be pro-trans without being a true believer in gender identity. In fact, the major historical turn my book investigates is that in the fortunes of gender identity itself. Gender identity, I show, was invented by psychologist Robert Stoller during the 1960s precisely in order to justify submitting trans children to conversion therapy and to gatekeep the majority of trans feminine adults from being able to access medical transition. So how did a term with such an explicitly transphobic origin become the very one on which our current battles for trans rights and recognition, for access to gender-affirming medical care, and in particular for the rights of trans children are based? Why is it so difficult to imagine any other foundation for trans politics or justification for trans existence? And how is it that in the midst of this hopeful investment in gender identity as a positive good, the fiction of gender identity continues to wreak harms on trans and gender diverse people, often continuing to fulfill its historical function as a hurdle before transition and as a means of separating respectable trans citizens from disreputable perverts? That is to say that what drew me to their book was their skepticism about gender identity, despite my suspicions about psychoanalysis, particularly given its anti-trans historical legacy. Along the way, however, I was enticed, seduced, and I dare say transformed by this very pleasurable encounter with a mode of thought and of clinical practice, or of practice, in this case clinical, which is quite different from my own. Gender Identity is this kind of transformative book. It is short, pretty much readable within a day. It is above all, though, a book with something to say. This is something all too rare given the publish or perish demands of academia. And to its credit, it both wastes no time in saying it and takes pains to ascertain that it is not misinterpreted. This exemplary clarity is a response to the transphobic conditions of the present in both psychoanalysis and in the greater worlds within which we work and live, particularly when childhood gender development is in question. It is apparent that Avgi and Anne's interrogation of the notion of core gender identity, something they refer to as at best simplistic and at worst problematic, is courageous. What pricks with both surprise and pleasure, and what ended up teaching me something, is the extraordinary sympathy and sense of ethical praxis they bring to the writing of this book. To critique and to question the terms of the prevailing common sense is a well-regarded and all too familiar move in the critical humanities and certainly in queer studies. What is far less common is to move beyond critique, in this case, critique of the doctrine of gender identity, to not only propose a compelling theory with great explanatory and critical power, one that Avgi and Anne draw from Laplanche in this case, but also to offer a veritable manual, though they say it's not a manual, I think I might disagree, on how to both ethically and productively psychoanalyze trans and gender diverse patients. While the audience for the latter is most obviously clinicians, and I think clinicians should be very excited to read this book, it is not hard to see how the kind of ethics of being in relation that they outline for clinical practice might be of use not only to clinicians, but also to teachers, parents, and anyone who might come into contact with a trans or gender diverse person. In fact, since the theory of gender formation they propose is a universal one, as true for gender typical as for gender diverse people, the ethics of being in relation that they outline could be useful for anyone encountering anyone who makes their gender out of a different set of beliefs, a different portion of what they call the mytho-symbolic than oneself, which is to say, for anyone at all. The theory they propose has several virtues. It dispenses with the fiction of a core gender identity while respecting patients' own assertions of gender identity. After all, as they write, identity is a set of claims that announces something that is true enough for the subject. Their theory acknowledges how people's claims about their gender are artifacts, made things, crafted out of the mytho-symbolic set of available historical discourses, rather than reflections of some pre-existing inner truth. Nonetheless, it acknowledges that the ability to exercise agency in putting these bits of discourse together, and as they mentioned, there isn't a pre-existing subject that then chooses and puts these discourses together, but rather these activities constitute the ego, right? But they acknowledge that this activity is crucial to them being able to own their gender at all. In short, Avgi and Anne understand gender as a response to the trauma of being, quote unquote, punctured by the intergenerational enigma of the others, primarily the parents' unconscious traumas and desires. Children respond to this foundational invasion by consolidating an ego and, crucially, by forming a gender. As they write, all gender is constructed out of the raw materials of what the other wants from or for us. Said differently, the other's invasion does not determine who we become. Rather, that invasion sets into motion the very process of our subjectivation. It is rather the response to this puncturing that consolidates as the ego, and also our experience of our gender. End quote. In the process, we draw from the material of the mytho-symbolic to explain our genders and ourselves in ways that might sometimes run counter to the desires of the very parents whose unconscious desires set this process into motion in the first place. So I just wanted to point out the way that this intergenerational trauma informs the subject, right? But is not limiting the subject, right? It doesn't impinge on a pre-existing subject, but informs it in ways that allow it to put into motion a process that is part of its own agency, right? Importantly, they importantly, they pointedly distance themselves from psychoanalytic interpretations that would understand the invasion of the desire of the other as an alien imposition that perverts the trans child, but not the cis child's, true biologically fixed gender identity. For Avgi and Ann remind us that the invasion of the other is the normative condition of all gender, not just that of trans and gender diverse people. For there is no innate core gender identity that pre-exists the intergenerational and relational process of subjectivation of which both gender and sexuality are parts. Quote, as long as the subject is able to modify what was handed down to them intergenerationally, Avgi and Ann write, and to forge out of these inheritances their own gender translations, gender is not pathology. They therefore reach the generous beating heart of their book, their ethical vision for the goal of treatment, which is, quote, so that the patient's gender can feel more integrated, more like their own creation. In so doing, they write, we may be able to help our patients be more in their gender with less shame and more pleasure, inhabiting gender as an idiom of their own forging, even if their gender may have originated through the other, as gender always does. The humanity of this proposal is elegant. In short, gender is a cultural artifact that results from a founding intergenerational trauma. However, it can also be made to feel like more than that, like something of our very own. This, in fact, could be the goal of psychoanalytic treatment. I am the rare trans person and the rare academic who has never been successfully therapized. I lied in therapy, I left therapy a couple of times, etc. I imagine I will not be the only one who, upon reading this moving little book, will wish to immediately enter therapy with a psychoanalyst who practices Ann and Avgi's vision of clinical practice. It is in the second section in which Ann and Avgi meditate on how to respond to a patient's request for they, them pronouns that their relational ethics mesh the most satisfyingly with their theory of gender. They propose there that the task of the analyst before the patient who requests they, them pronouns is not to take a side in the sense of simply affirming the patient's non-binary identity. And in fact, within the trans community, sometimes I bemoan the fact that the kind of prevailing ethics is to take a very hands-off approach to somebody's declaration of an identity, to just say, okay, well, that's who you are. I'm not going to ask any questions, right? I'm not going to propose anything. I'm just going to let you claim what you say, right? Sometimes a kind of process of questioning, of interaction, of guidance is precisely what people are calling for in this time of exploration, right? But to go on, it's not to do that, nor is it for the analyst, nor is it to pause in order to fully explore what this request means. They write, what if our task is not to explore what a request for a pronoun shift means, a focus that privileges represented, even if disguised or repressed meanings, but to attend to what this new form of address may enable, what future hatchings it may permit. We don't know, nor does the patient in question, who or how they will become through the trying on of this new pronoun as they speak it and think it, and as others speak it and think it of them, as it flushes their body and as it inflects their desire. Here, claiming non-binary gender identity is understood as the claiming of any new gender identity might be understood, not as a claim whose content may be true or false, but as a form of ignition, a vehicle for making things happen in one's psyche and in one's life, the beginning of an improvisatory, nonlinear, and interpersonal process. We would be lucky to have our own identity claims treated in this respect, and wise to view those of others in this light. So I'm going to close my response there and shift to asking a few questions of Avgi and Ann. It was really a pleasure to read this book, and I feel like we could go on talking about it for hours, right? So I'm just going to focus on a few questions that came to mind to me immediately. So one is that of and this is something that I'm genuinely curious about, and I think many people in the audience might be curious about. It has to do with the history of psychoanalysis, right? In terms of the harms that it has incurred towards trans people and towards queer people, right? and where you would position yourself within this history. You said you were part of a small group of psychoanalysts who were trying to practice trans and queer affirmative therapy. For those of us who aren't in the midst of the psychoanalytic world, how would you describe the trajectory of psychoanalysis regarding queer and trans patients, right, over these decades, perhaps since, Stoller's coinage of the term gender identity? And what are the currents that are going on within psychoanalysis right now regarding queer and trans people? You also mentioned in your book some studies, very problematic studies on, quote, social contagion as an effect of transness, and this, essentially retracted study that's so problematic by Evans and Evans of so-called rapid onset gender dysphoria. But do these kinds of studies emerge from a psychoanalytic basis or from some other kind of clinical basis?
And do you wanna go first, or? Okay. Kadji, thank you so much for this amazing set of comments, which, if anybody in the audience didn't know that you're not a psychoanalyst, they wouldn't know from your comments, because it's amazing how you're able to pick up on exactly the psychoanalytic tenets that we're working with to make our arguments. So I'm very grateful for that. And while I did not know and have not heard it said this way, that you're anti-psychoanalytic, I am also not surprised. I think that sentiment is very well earned by our discipline. And I completely understand and in some ways resonate myself as to why somebody would be anti-psychoanalytic. In some ways, I would say that I'll speak just for myself. I'm going to drop the we of the book for a moment. In our launch with Griffin Hansberry, Griffin asked me, I have heard you say many times that psychoanalysis needs to die. and I do believe that there is a version of psychoanalysis that absolutely needs to die and hopefully will go extinct. So I'm very allied with that sentiment and definitely with that project. I want to say a quick thing about the trajectory of psychoanalysis regarding queer and trans subjects, and where I think that a lot of people who are both within psychoanalysis and without do not realize how powerful of a role psychoanalysts have played in the anti-trans movement globally, and in what we are calling in our book, not just anti-transness and transphobia, but anti-trans clinical activism. In the authoring of works and the creation of theories that seek to actually building on ideas like gender identity and trauma, propose very psychoanalytic friendly and propose frameworks of thinking about transness that are very seductive. Some of them are openly transphobic, and some of them are not openly transphobic, but insert into the liberal thinking of liberal psychoanalysis what I think of as the ticking bomb of gender identity, in a way that makes it a matter of time for it to explode and have delayed effects that are problematic in thinking about patients whose gender shifts throughout the course of a treatment. So I just wanted to flag that for all of us, how important psychoanalysis has been, not just historically, but currently, how active it is in creating these kinds of harms.
Yeah, and just first, Kadji, thank you for that really incredible response. And to give us back our arguments in the way you did is also such an offering to us. But I'm thinking about the fact that we couldn't have written this book. We couldn't have thought this book without the resources available from queer and trans theories, and in particular, trans of color critique. I mean, your work was very influential for us. We're also really excited by the other work happening in trans negativity. We needed resources outside psychoanalysis because psychoanalysis is not adequate for the kind of work we need to do, for the kinds of people sitting with us in the room, right? And this is especially so for queer and trans subjects, but certainly psychoanalysis doesn't have a great history thinking about race, but psychoanalysis isn't adequate to think about so-called cisgenders either. Right? We need new ways of thinking about gender. And we're trying to put psychoanalysis not just into contact with work from other discursive sites, again, from queer and trans studies, for example, we're trying to break psychoanalysis down. Because it's not just about like assimilating ideas from other fields and like stuffing them through, the psychoanalytic sausage machine. Psychoanalysis has to be undone in order to become the psychoanalysis we actually need.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so, Foucault is my boyfriend. So we draw on Laplanche heavily in this text. Laplanche and Foucault were actually colleagues at university. Both studied under Althusser, for example. But, I think that, Foucault's, especially his later turn to think about basically desubjectivation and his interest in limit experience, that these are also things about which psychoanalysis has things to say. And certainly in Avgi's book that came out earlier this year, she's actually trying to do some of this thinking. But I'm greedy. I want to have my Foucault and I want to have my psychoanalysis too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I saw that in the way you refer to the mythopoetic, right? Or the mytho-symbolic, right? In a way that can also be seen as a kind of Foucaultian compendium of historical discourses, right? So that was friendly to me. But maybe that's also why this book read is so friendly to a scholar like me. But it also seems, it is helpful to know that overall psychoanalysis has had this hostile attitude towards trans and queer people and patients. But it also seems to me that psychoanalysis has certain affordances that you attempt to seize onto, right? In particular, in ways that get us beyond that impasse that you refer to in the beginning of the book between this kind of binary of and you talked about this a little bit in your opening, the born this way, supposedly pro-trans argument, and the warped this way, anti-trans argument, right? Which has so monopolized the airwaves that I think you rightly say that it's become very difficult to think outside of the terms of this binary. And I think that what I like about this is that you use psychoanalysis, some of the insights of psychoanalysis at least, as a way to do this, right? So I don't know if you want to say anything about the affordances of psychoanalysis as well, the ones that you find useful despite some of its problematic history.
Maybe I'll say something really quickly, and then Avgi, I'm sure you'll have things to say as well here. I think that psychoanalysis is exquisitely poised, or some versions of it are exquisitely poised, to actually talk about the idiosyncrasy of how any of us is in the world, including the idiosyncratic ways we change. And, having been teaching, social constructionist theories of gender and sexuality in the university context for actually 3 decades now, one of the things that we can do is we can offer all these amazing macro level histories, right? We can bust out anthropology, we can bust out critical social theories to show how gender and sexuality are socially constructed, blah, blah, blah. But that doesn't answer to why a particular category resonates for any one individual. And I think so there's such a gap between, you can persuade students, these are very persuasive theories, but when it comes to the lived life, well, what about, how to explain oneself? And at the same time that one should not have to explain oneself through any particular way to get equal rights, let alone freedom, we also are curious about our individual stories. And psychoanalysis, I think, or certain forms of psychoanalysis, the one we're trying to offer, could help answer to that curiosity without being pathologizing, right? It could open up space for that.
Sorry, did you want to say something, Avgi?
Yeah, I was just going to add that there is, you're absolutely right that there are affordances with its psychoanalysis. In some ways, I think we both use the affordances that are there, and we also wrested from the clutches of what can sometimes be put to quite conservative use. And I use the word conservative here not to speak about just outdated or kind of like of the past or anachronistic, but to speak about the tendency to conserve something, and to conserve what is already there, and to conserve what's established, the ground that's established. So one of the 2 key elements that I find that psychoanalysis has that other domains have not given me is the concept of the unconscious, which permits us to think both about transmission, but also about this queer agency of what can arise at the kind of like cross-hatching between that kind of like the historically contingent and that which comes to feel yours, not just because, as Anne was saying, the words resonate, but because it excites the body, because it lives on the body, because something demonic, and I use the word demonic not in a problematic sense, but in a potentiating sense, kind of like alights in the body. So that I have found psychoanalysis very important for. And then I found Laplanche especially very useful to think about trauma, not just as something that breaks us, which is how traumatophobic logics work, but to think of trauma as also providing energies that, if when approximated, when we rub up against them, when we pick at our wounds, can actually kind of like throw something up in the air that can then get reshuffled in a very different way and produce the circumstances for psychic transformations. And thinking traumatophilically is something that basic psychoanalysis has permitted me to do, even though psychoanalysis is primarily traumatophobic.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. I think that was a great articulation of the affordances that you were able to wrest from the more conservative uses of psychoanalysis, and that I kind of heard in your book. And that's also what I was hearing as the part that's so generous about your book, this curiosity about individual trajectories, right? And also the clarity with which you're able to point out the ways that that these social discourses, that we might study under the background of kind of social constructivist theories, right? Nonetheless, for them to be effective, for them to feel real, right, have to be picked up by some kind of non-conventional agency, right? Whether it's the agency of the unconscious, right, or something that emanates from a layer of the body, right? So it's never simply about some kind of unconscious wish of the parent imprinting upon a blank surface, right? Or some kind of social construction, again, constructing something that is otherwise blank. And I think this is something that resonates with trans people, right? That we're not just blank vessels for whatever kind of construction of gender that comes from wherever. There's something to it that has to do with a kind of adequate match. You talk about that a lot, right? A kind of good enough identity, a good enough gender, a good enough explanation for how we are who we are, right? That may not be true, right? On the level of true or false, right? Inner true self, right? Or whether we believe this certain discourse of gender is the truth or not, but that nonetheless is adequate to the needs of the subject. So that, I think that aspect of psychoanalysis became very clear to me as something that could be used very sympathetically and very generously. And I think you do that in this book. I wanted to ask another question. So, you mentioned that you think that that you think of gender identity, especially within psychoanalytic critical discourse, as a ticking time bomb, right? So what do you mean by that? What are the dangers of gender identity there? How can it be misused, right? And I don't know. So I've been thinking a little bit about some of the ways that gender identity can have negative psychic effects on trans people, the discourse of gender identity, right? So for instance, making someone's gender feel false or not real if they suspect that it might have been a response, for instance, to sexual trauma, right? Or making somebody have to, deny outright a whole aspect of their past in which they identified as another gender or another sexuality as absolutely false, never true, right? As a false consciousness in which there was another true gender there in the first place, right? Or as a reason why so-called detransitioners can sometimes be marginalized within trans communities, which makes them vulnerable to being co-opted by TERFs and people on the anti-trans right? Because they don't conform to this idea of a core gender identity. And if they do, it's one that says that transitioning was the thing that perverted that. So, but I've just been wondering if there are other examples that you've come across in clinical practice or thought about in your own work.
Yeah, I think this is such a great question, because in some ways we have left, we meaning those of us who think expansively about trans and queer life, we have left trauma to the right. Mm-hmm. And we do not touch it other than to talk about kind of like the traumatic effects of homophobia and transphobia. But the question of where trauma is in the psychic composition has been of a subject who does not understand themselves as cis or binary, it's been impossible to find because we're so terrified of it. So here's some places that I have found it. Like you were talking about, like the anxiety that precipitates on a subject who feels that their gender may be false because it may be a response to, say, for example, sexual trauma. I think the inverse also works, that to keep the gender feeling true, sexual trauma has to be denied, or it has to be minimized, or it's irrelevant. And if you combine that with the fact that it is a natural tendency to want to turn away from one's trauma, then it becomes kind of like really kind of like very difficult to then start speaking about that, because the fear is that it will immediately pathologize and make the person feel like, forget about what others feel, make the person themselves feel that there's something illegitimate or not true, that their gender is a scar tissue or something else, when of course gender is always scar tissue. And in that respect, what I wanted to say, like part of the intervention that we're trying to make is also to talk about cisness, like this presumption that cisness is just this natural thing. That is the other element of kind of like how the fiction of gender identity can be misused. It can make those who feel at home in their cis identification have more trouble, more shame, more difficulty embracing or exploring aspects of themselves that actually fall outside of what is supposed to be their gender identity. I mean, it has its own, so it creates this binary, it intensifies this binary. And we forget that cis genders are also constituted through trauma. They're also constituted through kind of like the mythosymbolic.
Yeah, thank you. So I think we need to open it up to hear from the audience a little bit. I would love to just keep you two to myself, but we must do so. So please, if you have any questions, go ahead and send them to the Q&A module on this venue. There's a question that I'm going to read aloud. So this is from Christina. This has been such a beautiful and exciting conversation, and I'm so excited to read and teach this book. My question, I wanted to hear from Anne and Avgi about their ethos in regards to productively engaging psychoanalysis. It's so exciting to see how you both engage with a flawed, violent, and inadequate tradition that you both still find powerfully generative. Do you think this ethos can apply to other intellectual traditions beyond psychoanalysis?
The short answer is yes. Also, first, Christina, thank you so much for that very generous question as well. I think so. I mean, in some sense, maybe we're saying, let's be scavengers. What can we make? What can we use, right? What can we put to work? So I even think about, okay, I mentioned my boyfriend Foucault, the limitations of Foucault, who for all the ways in which he actually gives us amazing ways, for example, to think about racialization. Through his thinking about biopolitics, there are only a few mentions in his text about colonization. So it's limited with respect to thinking about that, settler colonialism, the relationship between biopolitics and his colonial peripheries, but that, his work has been put to tremendous use within post-colonial studies. So I think, we can make use of things that are limited. I also work within religious studies. And, certainly I know that many secularists are very nervous about religious discourses. But I think there are multiple kinds of religious discourses, and what does it mean to listen with them, work with them in open ways, and not just cede religion, for example, to only conservative positions.
And I would add to that, much like with psychoanalysis, we're arguing not just for the incorporation of other ideas, but in fact for psychoanalysis to allow other ideas to undo it, to break it down, to transform it. I think in my mind, this is the only productive encounter between different disciplines, not one informing each other, but one actually performing what we might think of as the art and the function of criticism, kind of like Foucauldian critique on each other, so that it can become transformed, because this effort that especially psychoanalysts have to kind of like incorporate other ideas is basically, it's cannibalizing and eventually like completely the sausage metaphor that Anne was using, the sausage cutting, it produces like a very problematic combination as opposed to a redoing of analytic ideas. And I think that applies to other fields as well.
So I encourage you in the audience to go ahead and write in any questions you might have. While we wait for the next question, I wanted to kind of open the floor for you to say a little bit about the story of the genesis of this book, how it reached its current form, because I know it's actually quite an exciting and unusual story.
So we were not going to write a book. We had written a paper that had received an award from the International Psychoanalytical Association. And I want to say a little bit about that award because it's politically important. It was given by the first committee that was put together in the IPA on sex and gender in 2017. And that was really unusual. It took a lot of work, a lot of political work and fighting back against resistances for that committee to come together. And it was put together to fight institutional homotransphobia. And then an award was established that was called the Tiresias Prize. And we submitted this essay and won the first Tiresias Prize, and we were thrilled. And there was a lot of political excitement of this shift in psychoanalysis. So the committee had negotiated with a very influential journal in our field, in fact, established by Freud himself, the International Journal of Psychoanalysis, had negotiated a publication route. We submitted the paper. It got accepted twice in writing. We got a lot of revisions and comments, which we were very thankful for, and worked with the editors for a whole year revising the essay, and we were very pleased with the improvements. And then all that was left was to add the response to the latest feedback and to add the acknowledgement section, which we're going to thank the committee. And part of what we said in our acknowledgement section was to also welcome queer and trans subjects in psychoanalysis, not just as patients, but also as our teachers and our colleagues and our supervisors, and to dedicate to the paper in some way, to like start it with a hope, offering the work in the spirit of future generations of queer and trans analysts not having to go what some of us have had to endure in the field. And we sent what was going to be this last revision. And then we got the tone of the conversations really changed, and we were told that we needed to remove those lines from the acknowledgements and the new edits, and that now the publication offer was being retracted and made newly contingent on our compliance. And do you wanna say the rest of the story?
The short version is we're not very compliant people, hence this book.
Thankfully.
Yeah, we declined. I mean, it was really, to say it was deeply puzzling. We were bewildered. It was also, to use a word that's sometimes overused, it was actually traumatic. It was a very arduous summer of like back and forth, Zoom meetings, worries about lawsuits. I mean, it was a very difficult experience. And when we ultimately refused to edit the paper by taking out these two political lines from our acknowledgements, as we were told, by refusing to do that, basically that was the end of the publication prospects in that journal. So we wanted to find a home for it because, as we argue in the book, trauma is not just something that has to stop you in your tracks. It can also be a resource. I think a form of ignition, to use your amazing language, Kadji, I'm going to steal that, right? It could be a form of ignition for something else, because we kind of want to burn down the house of psychoanalysis. So we approached the Unconscious in Translation Press and Jonathan House to ask if he might be interested in publishing this as a short volume, and he encouraged us to expand it, and we did. And what emerged is the book you've read and blurbed, and which is now available for other people to dive into and have their hands burn with this hot book.
Exactly. So so any of you in the audience, if you weren't sure before, if you wanted to buy this book, I think after hearing this, you should be sure. You know, this is a piece of writing that was both award-winning and that seems to have attempted to be, you know, I might use the word censored by that same body. And so it's clearly saying something that's important. It's saying something that's touching, pushing buttons, I think, in all the right ways. And I think that you can hear through this conversation that this comes from a real desire to create a new type of psychoanalysis, one that can be affirming towards trans and gender diverse peoples, and one that more than simply affirming them, you know, can actually help them explore the issues they need to explore, right? Okay, so we have another question. And I'm not sure if this will be automatically cut off at 8:30 or if we have time to go on and answer it fully. But I'll go ahead. What's that?
I don't think we're going to be automatically stopped.
Okay, so I'll go ahead and read it. So what does owning one's gender look like while exploring more of the ways in which it has been generated as an artifact by the unconscious and is so influenced by the wishes of family and culture? Great question.
Yeah, that's a terrific question. And I should say that I think it's important to clarify when we're urging for space for these kinds of conversations, we are definitely not saying to our colleagues, here's your permission now to go hunting for your patient's gender antecedents. This is not about authorizing clinicians to go do like excavation archaeological work of what caused somebody's gender. We want to offer this as a resource so that clinicians who are working with patients who are moving in these directions can have the resource of being able to think without that necessarily capsizing into something that is transphobic or kind of like approximates conversion practices. So what does that look like? It looks like somebody feeling less anxious about the possibility that there might be connections between, like, as you were saying earlier, Kadji, like sexual violence and a shift of one's gender, or a traumatic event, or something that has kind of like a complicated family history that may have been negotiated through gender. This happens all the time with cisgenders, and we never look for cisgenders to be to become the site where that reparative work happens. So why would we do that? That is the resource that we want to extend to working with queer and trans people, the resource of complexity that is routinely afforded to cis subjects. And a patient of mine said recently something that was really extraordinary. After a lot of work and a lot of anxiety about these links that we're exploring, she said to me, what if it does have to do with trauma? So what? And that was so hard earned because it was not said superficially or defensively. Like, she had really come to a place of feeling, and maybe it does, but it's still me and it's still mine. And that was incredibly moving.
I mean, I love this question. And I'm also even thinking about something, I'm going to say simple, but it's really deceptively simple, as the giving of a name or the giving of a pronoun. Right? We're given names or given pronouns from before birth. Often parents have already thought of a name, right? And what does it mean to do with this gift? It's a very complicated gift. What does it mean for what you were given to become something that feels like yours? And I think that's also what the questioner is bringing up. How do we become agents of something over which we had no original choice? But that's the starting point for all agency, these contingencies of givenness, and a givenness that can sometimes feel like a violation. What are the processes by which we can, through our own agency, transform what was given to us against our consent, without our signing on to it, into something that feels like ours? Stretch these names, stretch these pronouns, perhaps coming to a new name, a new pronoun. But that, again, that we didn't get to choose the conditions of our coming to be in the world doesn't mean there's no agency. That's the starting point for what comes next.
Actually, so much that is psychically transformative and incredibly important happens at the limit of our consent.
Mm-hmm. For more on that, see Sexuality Beyond Consent. I assume. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. Thank you, Avi and Anne, for your book. Folks, you can buy it directly from the publisher. The link has been dropped in the chat several times. You can also find it through our website. Thank you, Kadji, for responding and participating as the conversation partner tonight for your response. And thank you all for attending. We have recorded tonight's event and we'll be sharing it after the event for you to share with those who weren't able to make it tonight. So thank you all so much and happy Pride.
Thank you for hosting us. Happy Pride.
Happy Pride.
Happy Pride with a little dose of interesting shame. And you can do something with. Yeah.